In 1943, American bomber crews had a nickname for themselves: dead men flying. Their survival rate was so low that completing 25 missions was considered a statistical miracle. German fighters were butchering them, and nobody could stop it. The problem wasn't courage. It wasn't tactics. It wasn't bombs. It was 50 gallons of fuel. That's the gap. That's what stood between American air power and total victory. And the solution? A paper tank that every engineer said would never work. This is the story of how one impossible invention killed the Luftwaffe. Before we get to the paper tanks and the impossible engineering, you need to understand just how bad things were for American airmen over Europe in 1943. This wasn't a war where both sides traded equal blows. This was a massacre. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a strategy called daylight precision bombing. The idea was simple on paper: fly over Germany during the day when you can actually see what you're bombing and destroy specific military and industrial targets. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, ball bearing plants, the infrastructure that kept the Nazi war machine running. The British thought this strategy was insane. They had tried daylight bombing early in the war and gotten slaughtered. The Royal Air Force switched to night bombing, flying under cover of darkness, accepting lower accuracy in exchange for survival. But the Americans were stubborn. American doctrine insisted that daylight precision bombing would work. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were heavily armed bombers designed to defend themselves. They flew in tight formations called combat boxes, where their combined firepower would create overlapping fields of fire. Any German fighter that attacked would fly into a wall of .50 caliber bullets. That was the theory anyway. The reality was different. German fighter pilots weren't stupid. They developed tactics specifically designed to break apart American bomber formations. They attacked head-on, where the bombers had fewer guns. They concentrated their attacks on lead aircraft, knowing that if the formation leaders went down, the rest of the bombers would scatter. They developed rockets and heavy cannons that could destroy a bomber from outside the range of defensive guns. And they waited until the American fighters turned back. That last point is crucial. American bombers didn't fly alone. They had fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, flying alongside them, protecting them from German attacks. These fighters were good. The P-47 was a beast of an aircraft, heavily armed and tough as steel. The P-38 was fast and could climb like nothing else in the sky. But they had one fatal flaw: range. A P-47 Thunderbolt could fly about 475 miles on internal fuel. A P-38 Lightning could manage around 350 miles. But the targets the bombers needed to hit, the factories deep inside Germany, were much farther than that. A mission to bomb Berlin required a round trip of nearly 1,200 miles. The fighters simply couldn't go that FAR.SO. Here's what happened on a typical mission in 1943. American bombers would take off from England with their fighter escorts. The fighters would protect them across the English Channel and into France. They'd fight off the first wave of German attacks over occupied territory. And then, somewhere over Belgium or the Netherlands, the fighters would waggle their wings, the signal for "we're out of fuel, we have to go home," and turn back toward England. And the bombers would fly on, alone, into Germany, where the Luftwaffe was waiting. The German pilots knew exactly when the American escorts turned back. They had radar. They had spotters. They tracked every mission. And they timed their attacks to begin precisely when the bombers lost their protection. The killing zone started at the German border and extended all the way to the target and back. Hours of flying through swarms of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s with no friendly fighters to help. The losses were staggering. Let me give you some specific numbers, because abstract talk of heavy losses doesn't capture the human reality. On August 17th, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a massive raid against ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt and aircraft factories in Regensburg. Ball bearings are essential components in almost every machine: tanks, aircraft, submarines, everything. destroy the ball-bearing factories, and the entire German war machine grinds to a halt. That was the theory. The mission involved 376 heavy bombers. 60 of them were shot down. That's 60 aircraft, each with a crew of 10 men. 600 Americans killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. And that's not counting the aircraft that made it back so badly damaged they never flew again. The Schweinfurt raid was a catastrophe, but it wasn't unique. On October 14th, 1943, a date that became known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force tried again. This time, 291 bombers attacked Schweinfurt. 60 were shot down. Over 600 men lost. 17 more bombers were so damaged they were written off. Total effective loss, 77 aircraft. That's more than 25% of the attacking force destroyed in a single mission. No military operation can sustain losses like that and continue. After Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force effectively suspended deep penetration raids into Germany. They simply couldn't afford to keep losing bombers at that rate. Crews were being killed faster than they could be trained. Aircraft were being destroyed faster than factories could replace them. The entire strategic bombing campaign, the cornerstone of American strategy for winning the war in Europe, was on the verge of collapse. And the Germans knew it. Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, was jubilant. His pilots were winning. The American bombers couldn't reach their targets without suffering catastrophic losses. As long as the fighters couldn't escort the bombers all the way to the target and back, Germany was safe. The solution was obvious: give the fighters more range. But that was easier said than done. Now, let me explain why extending a fighter's range is so difficult, because this is where the engineering comes in. An aircraft can only carry so much weight. Every pound of fuel you add is a pound you can't spend on other things: armor, ammunition, guns, the pilot's survival equipment. Fighter aircraft are designed to be light and agile. They need to outturn, outclimb, and outrun their enemies. Every ounce matters. Adding internal fuel capacity means making the aircraft bigger, which makes it heavier, which makes it slower and less maneuverable. You're trading combat performance for range. And against the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots flying nimble Bf-109s, any loss of performance could be fatal. But there's another way to add fuel. Put outside the aircraft. External fuel tanks called drop tanks have been around since the 1930s. The concept was simple: strap extra fuel tanks to the wings or fuselage. The fighter takes off with the extra fuel, flies toward the target using the drop tank fuel first, and when the tanks are empty or when combat begins, the pilot releases them. They drop away, the fighter is suddenly lighter and more maneuverable, and the fight is on. In theory, drop tanks could double or triple a fighter's range. In practice, there were serious problems. The first problem was engineering. A drop tank isn't just a fuel can with a strap. It has to be aerodynamically designed so it doesn't create too much drag. It has to be structurally strong enough to hold fuel under the stresses of flight. It has to connect to the aircraft's fuel system so the engine can actually use the fuel inside. And it has to release cleanly when the pilot hits the button. If a drop tank gets stuck, it's a death sentence in combat. All of this requires precision engineering and high-quality materials. In 1943, those materials were in short supply. Aluminum was desperately needed for aircraft production. Steel was going into tanks and ships. The manufacturing capacity for drop tanks was limited, and the tanks that did exist were expensive and time-consuming to produce. The second problem was strategic. Drop tanks are expendable. You use them once and throw them away. Every mission requires new tanks. If you're flying hundreds of bombers with hundreds of escort fighters, you need thousands of drop tanks every week. The logistics alone were overwhelming, and American generals were reluctant to invest massive resources in something that would be literally thrown away after one use. But the third problem was the biggest. Nobody believed drop tanks could give fighters enough range to matter. Here's the math that convinced everyone drop tanks wouldn't work. AP-47 Thunderbolt burns about 100 gallons of fuel per hour at cruise speed. To extend its range by 200 miles, you need roughly 100 more gallons of fuel. That's about 600 pounds of weight. You can strap a 75-gallon drop tank under each wing, which gives you 150 extra gallons, enough for maybe 300 miles of additional range. But that still doesn't get you to Berlin and back. You need even more fuel. But here's the problem. The more fuel you add, the more the aircraft weighs. The more it weighs, the more fuel it burns just to stay in the air. There are diminishing returns. At some point, you're adding fuel just to carry the fuel you added. It's like trying to run a marathon while carrying a backpack full of water bottles. The water helps, but the backpack slows you down. Engineers calculated that beyond a certain point, external tanks would actually reduce the aircraft's effective range because of the drag and weight penalties. There was a limit to how much range you could add, and that limit wasn't enough. The conclusion was clear. Drop tanks alone couldn't solve the escort problem. You needed an entirely new aircraft. Enter the P-51 Mustang. If the drop tank was the impossible solution that nobody believed would work, the P-51 was the impossible aircraft that nobody expected to succeed. The Mustang started life as a British request. In 1940, the Royal Air Force was desperately short of fighter aircraft. They approached North American Aviation, an American company, and asked if they could build P-40 Warhawks under license. North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, made a counter-proposal. Instead of building someone else's outdated design, let us build you something better. We can design and prototype a new fighter in 120 days. The British were skeptical. Designing a fighter aircraft from scratch typically takes years, not months. But they were desperate. They agreed. North American delivered. In just 102 days, 18 days ahead of schedule, they produced the prototype NA-73X, which would become the P-51 Mustang. It was one of the most remarkable feats of aircraft design in aviation history. But there was a catch. The original P-51A used an Allison V-1710 engine, which was a perfectly adequate power plant at low altitudes, but lost performance above 15,000 feet. Most air combat over Europe happened at 20,000 to 30,000 feet, where the Allison-powered Mustang couldn't compete with German fighters. The aircraft was fast, nimble, and beautiful, but it couldn't fight where the fights were happening. The original P-51 was assigned to ground attack and reconnaissance roles, where its low-altitude performance was an asset rather than a liability. It seemed like another promising aircraft that couldn't quite deliver. Then someone had a brilliant idea. Put a different engine in it. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was the power plant that made the Spitfire legendary. It was a supercharged V12 engine that maintained its power at high altitudes, exactly where the Allison faltered. British engineers wondered what would happen if you put a Merlin in a Mustang airframe. In late 1942, they tried it. The results were astonishing. The Merlin-powered Mustang, designated P-51B, was faster than the Spitfire, faster than the Bf-109, faster than the FW-190. It could climb like a rocket and turn with the best fighters in the world. And thanks to its incredibly efficient laminar flow wing, a revolutionary design that reduced drag, it was also remarkably fuel efficient. That fuel efficiency was crucial. The P-51B could fly farther on the same amount of fuel than any other high-performance fighter. Its internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons gave it a combat radius of about 400 miles, already better than the P-47 or P-38. But that still wasn't enough for Berlin. To get all the way to the German capital and back, the Mustang needed even more range. It needed drop tanks, big ones. And this is where the story gets interesting. The engineers who had said drop tanks couldn't solve the escort problem were looking at the P-47 and P-38. Those aircraft were gas guzzlers compared to the Mustang. The P-47 had a massive radial engine that drank fuel like a sailor on shore leave. Adding external tanks helped, but you hit the diminishing returns wall quickly. The P-51 was different. Its efficient engine and clean aerodynamics meant that every gallon of drop tank fuel translated into more miles of range than it would on any other fighter. The same calculations that showed drop tanks were marginal improvements for the P-47 showed they were game changers for the P-51. With two 75-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could escort bombers to Berlin and back. With larger 108-gallon tanks, it could go even farther, all the way to Poland if necessary. The combination of the Mustang's inherent efficiency and the extra fuel from drop tanks created something the Luftwaffe had never faced: an American fighter that could follow the bombers anywhere. There was no more escort limit. There was no more turning back point. There was nowhere in Germany that American bombers could fly that American fighters couldn't follow. The math had changed. But before the P-51 could transform air war, there was one more problem to solve: making enough drop tanks. Here's where the paper tanks come in, and this is the part of the story that sounds like fiction. Traditional drop tanks were made of metal, aluminum, or steel. They were sturdy, reliable, and relatively expensive to manufacture. Each tank required skilled metal workers, precise forming equipment, and materials that were in high demand for other war production. Building enough metal drop tanks for hundreds of fighters flying daily missions was a logistical nightmare. Someone in the historical record is unclear on exactly who deserves credit. Proposed an alternative: make the tanks out of compressed paper. Not flimsy paper like a newspaper. Compressed, laminated, resin-treated paper that was formed into the shape of a tank and sealed to hold liquid. It was called impregnated paper composition, or sometimes fiber tanks. They were cheaper than metal. They required less strategic material to produce. Factories that couldn't produce aluminum could produce paper. And critically, they worked. The compressed paper tanks could hold fuel without leaking. They could withstand the stresses of takeoff and flight. They released cleanly when dropped. And because they were expendable anyway, their lower durability didn't matter. They only needed to work once. When engineers first saw the proposal, many of them laughed. Paper fuel tanks? On a combat aircraft flying at 400 miles per hour? That's not engineering. That's a joke. But the joke worked. Paper tanks began rolling off production lines in early 1944. Suddenly, the logistical bottleneck disappeared. Every P-51 could carry the fuel it needed to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The man most responsible for turning this technological advantage into a strategic revolution was Major General James "Jimmy" Doolittle. You might recognize his name from the Doolittle Raid, the 1942 bombing of Tokyo that boosted American morale after Pearl Harbor. But Doolittle's greatest contribution to victory wasn't that famous raid. It was his transformation of the 8th Air Force's fighter tactics. When Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, the American fighters were being used purely defensively. Their job was to stay close to the bombers and protect them from attack. This made sense on the surface. The bombers were the mission, and protecting them was the priority. But Doolittle recognized that this strategy was doomed to fail. As long as the German fighters could choose when and where to attack, they maintained the initiative. The American escorts could only react. Doolittle made a radical change. He ordered his fighters to go on the offensive. Instead of staying close to the bombers, they would range ahead, seeking out German fighters and destroying them wherever they found them. If the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept the bombers, the P-51s would pounce on them before they could reach the formation. If the Germans stayed on the ground, the Mustangs would strafe their airfields. The goal wasn't just to protect the bombers, it was to destroy the Luftwaffe itself. This was a fundamental shift in doctrine. Doolittle was saying, the best defense is an overwhelming offense. Don't wait for the enemy to attack. Hunt them, kill them, destroy their ability to fight. The fighters were no longer escorts. They were executioners. The strategy worked beyond anyone's expectations. In 1944, Yeager was a young fighter pilot flying P-51s out of Leiston, England. On October 12, 1944, Yeager shot down 5 German fighters in a single mission, becoming an ace in a day. He finished the war with 11.5 aerial victories. But even Yeager wasn't the highest scorer in his group. That honor went to Leonard Kit Carson with 18.5 victories. The 357th Fighter Group as a whole claimed over 600 enemy aircraft, destroyed more than any other American fighter group in the European theater. These pilots developed tactics that maximized the Mustang's advantages. The P P-51 was faster than almost anything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. It had excellent visibility from its bubble canopy, and it could dive like a stone, accelerating to speeds that German aircraft couldn't match. American pilots learned to fight from above, diving on their enemies from higher altitude, making their attacks, and zooming back up before the Germans could react. They fought in pairs, with a lead pilot and a wingman watching each other's backs. They used their superior range to position themselves advantageously before combat even began, and they pressed their attacks aggressively, following damaged aircraft down to finish them off. The contrast with the Luftwaffe situation was stark. German pilots were being rushed through abbreviated training programs to fill the gaps left by losses. New pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with barely 100 hours of flying time, a fraction of what American pilots received. They were thrown into combat against veterans like Gentile and Jaeger, and they died in droves. The experienced German aces who survived were forced to fly mission after mission without rest, slowly wearing down from exhaustion and stress. And with each passing week, there were fewer of them left. I want to zoom out and talk about what this meant strategically, because the destruction of the Luftwaffe's fighter force was one of the decisive factors in winning World War II. By the spring of 1944, the Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. D-Day was coming, but the invasion could only succeed if the Allies controlled the skies over the beachheads. If the Luftwaffe could operate freely over Normandy, they could devastate the landing forces. Troops crowded onto beaches would be defenseless against strafing fighters. Landing craft would be sitting ducks. The entire operation would be at risk. The pre-invasion air campaign had two goals: destroy German infrastructure to prevent reinforcements from reaching the beaches, and eliminate the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. The P-51s accomplished the second goal with devastating efficiency. By June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was so battered. Let me talk about the numbers, because the scale of the destruction is almost hard to comprehend. The video title mentions 5,000 German planes destroyed, and that number is roughly accurate for the combined claims of P-51 Mustang units during the war. The 8th Air Force alone claimed over 5,000 aerial victories from 1942 to 1945, with a majority of those coming after the P-51 became operational. The 9th Air Force, which provided tactical air support for ground forces, added thousands more. And these are just the claims for aerial combat. The totals don't include aircraft destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks, which added thousands more to the Luftwaffe's losses. The human cost of the Luftwaffe was even more devastating than the aircraft losses. An airplane could be replaced. An experienced pilot cannot. The German pilot training system simply couldn't keep up with the losses. By the end of 1944, many new Luftwaffe pilots were receiving just a few hours of flight training before being sent into combat. These inexperienced pilots were easy prey for American veterans. The casualty rate among new German pilots was astronomical. And with each loss, the average experience level of the Luftwaffe dropped further, making the survivors even more vulnerable. It was a death spiral. The more pilots the Germans lost, the worse their remaining pilots became, which meant they lost even more pilots. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively a spent force, capable of occasional desperate gestures, but no longer able to contest Allied air superiority. Now I want to return to the drop tanks, because the engineering triumph they represented deserves more attention. The paper tanks I've been discussing were actually called composition tanks or fairy tanks. They were made from a mixture of wood pulp, paper, and resin, pressed into shape and hardened into a surprisingly strong material. Each tank was designed to hold either 75 or 108 gallons of aviation fuel. They were manufactured by companies that normally made things like insulation or packaging materials, factories that had nothing to do with the aircraft industry. This was the genius of the design. It used industrial capacity that was otherwise going unused for war production. A factory making paper containers could be converted to make drop tanks without taking resources away from aircraft or weapons production. The tanks weren't as durable as metal. They couldn't be reused, but they were cheap, they worked, and they could be produced in enormous quantities. By mid-1944, hundreds of thousands of drop tanks were being manufactured every month. The supply problem that had seemed insurmountable in 1943 had simply disappeared. But here's the thing that really makes this story incredible. The drop tank solution was there all along. The basic technology existed in the 1930s. External fuel tanks had been used on aircraft for years. The engineering challenges were significant, but not insurmountable. The compressed paper construction technique was novel, but it wasn't revolutionary. It was just a clever application of existing material science. So why did it take until 1944 for the solution to be implemented? Why did thousands of American airmen die over Germany, while the answer sat waiting to be discovered? Part of the answer is bureaucratic inertia. The Army Air Forces had established doctrines and procedures that didn't prioritize escort range. The assumption was that bombers could defend themselves. That was the whole point of the B-17's heavy armament and formation tactics. When that assumption proved wrong, it took time for the institution to adapt. Part of the answer is resource competition. Building drop tanks meant diverting materials and manufacturing capacity from other priorities. In a war economy where everything was in short supply, every allocation decision had consequences. Prioritizing drop tank production meant something else wouldn't get produced. Part of the answer is technological timing. The drop tanks were only part of the solution. You also needed an aircraft efficient enough to use them effectively. The P-51B, with its Merlin engine, didn't become available until late 1943. Even with infinite drop tanks, the earlier P-47s and P-38s couldn't have escorted bombers to Berlin. The Mustang was the key that made everything else work. But part of the answer is also a lesson about how institutions respond to challenges. The drop tank solution required someone to challenge the prevailing wisdom, to say the experts are wrong, this can work, and then to prove it. That kind of contrarian thinking is rare and often discouraged in large organizations. The people who said drop tanks couldn't solve the escort problem weren't stupid. They had done the math and reached a logical conclusion. They were just working from the wrong assumptions. Breaking those assumptions required fresh thinking and a willingness to challenge the consensus. Let me tell you about a specific mission that illustrates how the P-51 and its drop tanks changed everything. On March 4, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first mission to Berlin. This was a symbolic target as much as a strategic one, the German capital, the heart of the Nazi regime. Previous attempts to reach Berlin had been turned back by weather or by overwhelming Luftwaffe resistance. But on March 4th, the weather cleared. And this time, the bombers weren't alone. 800 heavy bombers, escorted by over 600 fighters, including P-51s carrying drop tanks, headed for Berlin. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything they had. This was their capital. This was personal. German fighters rose from airfields all across central Germany to intercept the Americans. What followed was one of the largest air battles of the war. The P-51s dropped their tanks and tore into the German formations. Bombers that would have been helpless just months earlier now had protectors that could match anything the Luftwaffe threw at them. The fighting was savage. Both sides took losses. But the Americans reached Berlin. They dropped their bombs, and they flew home. The 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. That day, heavy losses by any measure. But the Luftwaffe lost even more. And critically, the Americans had proven they could hit Germany's most important city in return. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. For the Germans, Berlin's vulnerability exposed the bankruptcy of their defensive strategy. If American bombers could reach the capital in broad daylight, escorted by fighters the entire way, then nowhere was safe. Göring, who had famously promised that no enemy bombs would fall on Germany, was humiliated. Hitler's confidence in the Luftwaffe, already shaky, crumbled further. Resources were poured into air defense at the expense of other priorities. Anti-aircraft batteries that could have been supporting ground forces on the Eastern Front were instead positioned around German cities. Fighter production was accelerated, but the pilots to fly those fighters were in increasingly short supply. The German war effort was being distorted by the need to respond to an American air offensive that couldn't be stopped. For the Americans, the Berlin mission was vindication. All the deaths over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, all the losses in the dark days of 1943 had not been in vain. The strategy of daylight precision bombing could work, but only with proper fighter escort. The investment in P-51s and drop tanks was paying dividends. The 8th Air Force would return to Berlin again and again in the following months, each mission hammering German industry and killing more Luftwaffe fighters. The Americans were winning the air war, and they knew it. I want to talk about the human cost on the German side, because it's easy to celebrate American victory without acknowledging that the enemies were also human beings. The Luftwaffe pilots who died in 1944 and 1945 were not all fanatical Nazis. Many were young men, barely out of their teens, drafted into a war they didn't start and thrown into combat against opponents who outmatched them in every way. They flew obsolete tactics in declining aircraft against enemies who had better machines, better training, and numerical superiority. The mortality rate among German fighter pilots in the final year of the war was staggering. Entire graduating classes of pilot training schools were wiped out within weeks of reaching frontline squadrons. Veterans who had survived years of combat were finally killed by the relentless American offensive. Aces with dozens of victories men who had been among the best pilots in the world were shot down by young Americans flying superior aircraft. The German names are less familiar to American audiences. Walter Nauetny, with 258 victories, killed in November 1944. Heinrich Erler, with 208 victories, killed in April 1945. Thousands of others whose names are forgotten. They were enemies, yes. Many of them were fighting for a monstrous regime. But they were also human beings doing what they believed was their duty, dying in a war that was already lost. The P-51 was a magnificent weapon, but it was a weapon. And like all weapons, it killed people. That's worth remembering. Let me return to the technical aspects for a moment, because the P-51's design innovations deserve more attention. The aircraft's most distinctive feature was its laminar flow wing. Conventional aircraft wings have a curved upper surface that creates lift. Air flowing over this surface becomes turbulent, creating drag that slows the aircraft and burns fuel. The P-51's wing was designed to delay this transition to turbulence, maintaining smooth laminar airflow over a larger portion of the wing surface. This reduced drag significantly, allowing the aircraft to fly faster on less fuel than competitors with conventional wings. The laminar flow concept had been developed by NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, predecessor to NASA, but the P-51 was one of the first production aircraft to implement it successfully. The design required extremely precise manufacturing tolerances. Any imperfection in the wing surface, a rivet head sticking up, a dent, even heavy paint could trigger turbulence and negate the laminar flow advantage. Early Mustangs sometimes lost their efficiency advantage because of manufacturing inconsistencies. But as production processes improved, the wing's advantages became more consistent. Combined with the powerful Merlin engine and the efficient fuselage design, the laminar flow wing made the P-51 one of the most aerodynamically refined aircraft of its era. It was literally designed to squeeze maximum performance from every gallon of fuel. The drop tank release mechanism was another engineering challenge that had to be solved reliably. When a pilot is in combat, with his life on the line, he can't afford to have his drop tanks fail to release. A tank that hangs up creates drag and limits maneuverability, potentially fatal disadvantages in a dogfight. Early drop tank designs sometimes had release problems. Tanks would fail to separate, or they would hang at an angle, creating asymmetric drag that made the aircraft difficult to control. Engineers refined the release mechanisms repeatedly, improving reliability to the point where pilots could trust them implicitly. The release was controlled by a single switch or lever in the cockpit. Hit the switch, and both tanks dropped away cleanly. The pilot would feel the aircraft surge forward as drag suddenly decreased, and he'd know he was ready to fight. There's another aspect of the drop tank story that deserves mention. What happened to all those tanks after they were dropped? Millions of drop tanks were jettisoned over Europe during the war. They fell into forests, farmland, cities, and lakes. Some exploded on impact if they still contained fuel vapors. Others buried themselves in soft ground. After the war, cleanup operations recovered thousands of them. Farmers plowing their fields would hit buried tanks. Children would find them in woods and rivers. They became a kind of war surplus, useless for their original purpose, but occasionally repurposed into water troughs, storage containers, or scrap metal. For decades after the war ended, drop tanks kept surfacing across Europe. They were physical reminders of the air war that had raged overhead, now scattered across the landscape like strange artifacts from another era. Let me tell you about the broader strategic impact of the P-51 and its drop tanks. The destruction of the Luftwaffe didn't just affect the air war over Germany, it affected every front. The German army had relied on air support throughout the war. Close air support tactics, pioneered during the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1941, required fighters and bombers to work in coordination with ground forces. But by 1944, the Luftwaffe couldn't provide that support anymore. Its fighters were needed for homeland defense. Its bombers had been largely destroyed. The ground forces had to fight without air cover, while their enemies had near-total air superiority. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets exploited the Luftwaffe's weakness ruthlessly. Soviet ground attack aircraft, the famous Il-2 Sturmovik, roamed the battlefield with impunity, destroying tanks, trucks, and troop concentrations. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of aircraft engines, because the planes overhead were almost never friendly. The same situation prevailed in Italy, in France after D-Day, and everywhere else German forces fought. The P-51s over Germany had drawn Luftwaffe fighters away from every other theater, leaving German ground forces exposed. The impact on German production was equally devastating. The strategic bombing campaign, which the P-51s made possible, systematically destroyed German industrial capacity. Synthetic fuel plants were particular targets, because Germany had no natural oil supplies and depended on converting coal into fuel. By late 1944, German fuel production had collapsed. Tanks sat idle because there was no gasoline. Aircraft that survived American attacks couldn't fly because there was nothing to put in their tanks. Pilots couldn't train because fuel couldn't be spared for training flights. The fuel shortage became a vicious cycle, accelerating the Luftwaffe's decline and crippling the German war effort at every level. Oil production became so critical that Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later identified the bombing of oil targets as the decisive factor in Germany's defeat. And it was the P-51s, with their drop tanks, that made those bombing raids possible. I want to address a question that might be forming in your mind. If drop tanks were so important, why aren't they more famous? The answer is that drop tanks aren't glamorous. They're not sleek fighters or powerful bombers. They're just metal or paper containers that hold fuel. They don't have pilots or combat records or dramatic stories. They're invisible enablers, the infrastructure that makes the heroic stuff possible. Military history tends to focus on the dramatic, the aces with their kill counts, the battles with their decisive moments, the leaders with their bold decisions. The logistics that make everything work, the fuel and ammunition and spare parts and drop tanks, tend to fade in the background. But as any military professional will tell you, logistics wins wars. The same invisibility affects the engineers and production workers who made the drop tanks. We know the names of pilots like Gentile and Jaeger. We know the generals like Doolittle and Arnold. But who designed the compressed paper tanks? Who figured out the manufacturing process? Who ran the factories that produced hundreds of thousands of them? These people are largely anonymous. They didn't receive medals or newspaper coverage. They just did their jobs, solving problems and making things, contributing to victory in ways that nobody noticed at the time and few remember now. This is true of most of the people who won World War II. For every combat soldier whose story gets told, there were a dozen support personnel whose stories don't. For every famous general, there were thousands of staff officers and planners and logisticians working behind the scenes. The war was won by collective effort, not individual heroism. The individual heroes stand out because they're exceptional, but they wouldn't have accomplished anything without the vast machine supporting them. Let me bring this back to the central argument of this video. The story of the P-51 and its drop tanks is a story about how impossible becomes inevitable. In 1943, the problem seemed unsolvable. Fighters couldn't escort bombers to the deep targets. The math didn't work. The fuel didn't exist. Everyone who analyzed the problem came to the same conclusion. It can't be done. A year later, it was being done every day. American fighters were flying to Berlin and back, destroying the Luftwaffe, making the bombing campaign possible, winning the air war. What changed? Not the fundamental physics, not the basic requirements. What changed was that someone found a way. The P-51's efficiency, combined with the drop tank's extra fuel, created a solution that hadn't existed before. The impossible became possible because people refused to accept impossible as an answer. This pattern shows up throughout history. Problems that seem insurmountable are often solved by innovations that nobody anticipated. The key is persistence, continuing to search for solutions, even when the experts say there aren't any. The experts aren't always wrong, of course. Some problems really are impossible. But other problems are just hard, and the difference between impossible and hard is often only visible in hindsight. The people who solved the escort problem in 1944 weren't smarter than the people who said it couldn't be solved in 1943. They just kept working, kept experimenting, kept looking for alternatives. And eventually, they found one. I want to conclude by talking about what happened after the war. The P-51 Mustang remained in service for years after Germany's surrender. It flew combat missions in Korea, a decade after it first appeared over Berlin. The drop tank concept that had been pioneered during World War II became standard equipment for military aircraft worldwide. Every modern fighter carries external fuel tanks for extended range missions. The engineering that solved the escort problem in 1944 is still being used today. The pilots who flew P-51s during the war went on to diverse careers. Chuck Yeager became a test pilot and broke the sound barrier. Others became airline captains, business executives, or returned to the small towns they had left. Many never talked about what they had experienced. The war was over, and they wanted to move on. But what they had done mattered. The air campaign over Germany was one of the decisive factors in winning the war.